I'm Julianne Horvath. On most places on the internet, you can find me at Nerdcore. I hate soliciting myself, but there's 3 R's. Oh, yeah, there's 3 R's. It's kind of nerve-wracking to think you might misspell your own name, but I got it up there. So if you want to talk to me at any point over the interwebs, that's where you'll find me. So, like I said, I'm Julie. I design and build stuff at GitHub. How many people use GitHub in this room? That's fucking amazing. Thank you guys for paying my salary. That's great. And if you don't, that's good too. Anyways, that's really exciting to see. So I don't have to go through the whole what's a GitHub thing, which is kind of exciting for me. I can kind of move along. So I like to think of myself as a designer who writes or who thinks in code, but mostly it's because I write code. And a lot of people ask, you know, should a designer learn to code? My answer is maybe, always. A designer should learn to code if they want to build things. We all engineer software. I think someone recently said it really well, my coworker Kyle Neath, who said, regardless of what tool you're using to design software or build software, we're all engineering it together. So don't necessarily force your designers to learn how to code, but if they want to, I'm here to tell you how to kind of put together a design environment to build and design software. So I wanted to kind of entitle this talk, Hacking a Design Environment. You hear dev environment really often, but you don't ever hear design environment. You hear, oh, I design in Photoshop, I design in Fireworks, I design in Illustrator, or I design in browser, which is becoming more and more common. So I maybe got to that a little prematurely. Okay, so I have given a variation of this talk before, and I called it Because Fuck Photoshop, but I've decided to kind of reel back the F-bombs and talk a little bit more about the design environment and what that means, and supplementing like different design tools into that environment. So my process, which is becoming, again, more and more popular, is designing in browser. And what that means is I use a variety of tools, and I work almost exclusively in code. So my process happens in code, mostly in code. So I do supplement, my design process with things like, if I need an illustration, I'm obviously not going to do that in browser yet. Hopefully, with us moving the web forward someday, maybe that's going to be a reality, or something like HTML5 Canvas or something like that. So let's talk about the status quo. So I've looked through, and I do this kind of for fun because I like to see what's out there. And to stay competitive, it is good to see what kind of jobs people are offering and what really they're asking of their designers. And one that I commonly see is pixel perfect Photoshop comps. And this is usually the tagline, and it's on almost every fucking design ad for a job ever. So not that there's anything necessarily wrong with this, but the problem is when you start to think about the end product. So what you're asking of your designers when you say that is the one requirement of them is you're saying that that's what they're responsible for. That's their responsibility as your coworker, as your employee, and also as a designer. So the problem with that is the end product of what they're creating is a picture of a website. How many of you know who Megan Fisher is? Oh, that's a shame. Really? Okay, Megan Fisher is an incredible designer, and she's really, really popular for being kind of a proponent of mocking up and markup. And that's sort of a big part of my process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But one thing she said a while ago that I think is really smart is a website's design should start where it's going to live. And I don't know about what you guys are necessarily building, but it's most likely either going to end up in the browser, right? If it's a web product, it's going to end up in the browser. If it's an iPhone app, it's going to end up on an iPhone. So this is kind of a quote that I like to kind of live by and think about when I'm approaching a project. So like I said, most of my stuff starts in a browser somewhere. But I also use a lot of other tools. One of those is a code editor. And then another is obviously the terminal or command line. You don't have to use the command line to push code somewhere, but it is a really great tool to learn and master. And if you weren't aware of this, I think Wednesday, we're doing a Git workshop here at HTML5 Dev Conf with Matthew McCullough and our training team, which is really, really useful. Even if you know basic Git stuff, it's good to kind of learn some advanced stuff, some tricks. So that's going to be available, I think. I'm not sure if it's sold out or not, so my apologies if it has. So these are two tools I use. So the code I write a lot of CSS. And CSS3 is the first time that, as designers, we're really able to kind of pull in a lot of these Photoshop effects that you're used to seeing in Photoshop comps, and you're allowed to do them purely in CSS. So some of these are lighting effects. You want to make like a container on a page pop out a little more. You're going to give it a highlight, something like a box shadow. So some other things are multiple background shadows and some interaction layer stuff too with CSS transitions. So there's a really great site that's actually, I guess, kind of dated, but it was when I learned CSS for the first time, or CSS3, and it's something by Dan Cederholm, and it's called Things We Left on the Mood, and it's really just an example of all of the different CSS3 elements that you can use today in browser that are actually fairly well supported across browser. So another reason I do this is we have this new thing called Retina displays, and they're becoming more and more common. Obviously, they're probably a low percentage of your user base, but you still want to be able to support that. And a great way to implement that in browser is to use things that scale really well, so you can actually look at how they'll look in Retina by just zooming in on a web page. So it can be a lot easier. And one tool that we use specifically at GitHub is icon fonts. So I don't know how many of you have seen our icons on github.com. Okay, I hope so, because they're fucking everywhere. So we went out of the way to create our own icon font so that we could use scalable images, so it could be across Retina, and also so that we have like a visual language to communicate with our users. Another thing we do to prepare for Retina is using 4x images. So what we do is we essentially create, we load images at 4x the size that we actually need them, so that it translates to Retina for us without having to use media queries or any kind of JavaScript plugin. So Sass and SCSS. Sass is basically a way to hack CSS. It allows you to pass in variables and do a little more complicated, abstract kind of ideas within your code. So it allows you to work faster in a lot of ways, and for me, I found it specifically useful when working in browser with things like lighten, for example. So what you're seeing is gray is actually a color variable that I've defined somewhere else in my CSS. But if I want to say, let's say I'm doing a button, and I don't know, for those of you who aren't really design heavy, you usually want, to make that button look realistic, you usually want the top border to be a little lighter than the bottom border. So what you want to do is give the top border a lighter color. And let's say I don't have all the fucking time in the world to sit in Photoshop and color pick all day, or scale with different colors. I can literally just tell them, okay, I want to lighten this gray by 10% if that's the background color of the button. And it works the same way with darken. And this is all built into Sass, and it's really easy to install. It's just gem install Sass, which is really great if you use Ruby gems. So another thing I really love about Sass is that it handles errors like a fucking champ. So if you work with an application framework like Rails, and you're working in browser, and you're testing locally, obviously, you're reloading your CSS and looking for changes, one way to do that, or one thing that's really awesome about Sass is it actually throws an error for you that's common if you're writing Ruby logic or something like that. It'll throw a syntax error for you and tell you which line of your code has the CSS error. And I don't know how many of you have written a lot of CSS, but if you're writing in a specifically large file, sometimes you will have accidentally left out a semicolon, especially if you're working at 3 a.m. in the morning. That seems to be a lot more common. But you end up having to scroll through line by line trying to find where you left out that semicolon. Sass kind of eliminates that for you, at least to a certain extent. So that's why I love Sass. So another great thing about designing in browser is you don't have to face the inconsistency that you usually deal with when translating a Photoshop comp to a living, breathing website. So one of these things that I feel gives me the most rage as a designer is how different browser rendering, it changes, across browser. And I'm not just talking about older legacy browsers like IE6. I'm talking about every single browser renders a color differently. They render box shadows differently, unless they're powered by the same rendering engine. So one way to avoid, having to go back into Photoshop and kind of alter and kind of tweak the color changes that you want to make is to do it all at one time. So I guess the way that I like to describe it is kind of like this cross-browser in, and I have a bunch of browsers open at one time, and I'm testing colors to get the best kind of median in order to display the kind of, I don't know, aesthetic feel that I want to create in my website or app. So another thing that if you haven't experienced font rendering rage yet, I'm deeply envious of you. Photoshop CS6 recently, so usually the rendering of fonts in Photoshop is really, really, really inaccurate to how it will render in the browser. So you end up with all these problems like, well, this font looked great in Photoshop, but it turns out, one, like we don't have a web license to even display this font. Even if you're using something like @FontFace, a lot of fonts aren't rendered or aren't built to be rendered on the web. They're built for print, and they're built for other mediums. And so in order to try to combat this, Photoshop thought they would make it better by giving you a bunch of different anti-aliasing options, but really there's no equivalent to these necessarily in the browser, or at least they don't explain them well enough for you to know. So that's one way to avoid this, is just to start in browser with your fonts. Also use web-safe fonts or something that in Typekit or something that you can @FontFace fairly safely. So I don't, if you are front-end developers, you may have at one time gotten a Photoshop comp from your designer, and once you put it into the browser, you realize, holy shit, this looks terrible, because one, maybe they designed something that is more common for a Flash website, or technology that we don't really use anymore to build websites, something that's not realistic. And so starting in the browser can kind of help you avoid some of those problems. And it also, if your designers code, it teaches them to be more practical, I think. So like I said, Zen mode is perfect for this. If you have, a bunch of browsers open, and this is a big part of my design environment, is having, Firefox open, having Safari open, having even GitHub. We don't support older versions of IE, but I still like to look across all the other browsers at the same time and get the best kind of experience for my users. Debugging CSS is fantastic with dev tools these days. So, Chrome web dev tools are amazing also. But it allows you kind of to play with something in Web Inspector and check it out before you make those changes to your code or your design. JavaScript. A lot of people ask me if your designers should learn JavaScript. Again, my answer will always be if they want to, but another good reason is you want to be able to design interactions. There's a lot of assembly line type shops now that say, okay, you're a visual designer, you're a UX designer, you're an interaction designer. These things should really all be one. And that's kind of what we look for when we hire designers at GitHub. We actually only hire designers who code, and we'd like people to be responsible for the entire experience. So the reason that I use JavaScript, when I use JavaScript, is to create kind of these interactions. And there's a lot of tools that allow you to do that really easily these days with jQuery and other things like Bootstrap plugins and all of these things if they don't actually want to write the JavaScript themselves. Explain that a little ahead again. So, software crashes really fucking suck, right? Like, there's oh my God, I can't even think of how many times I've been towards the end of finishing something or something I consider to be almost done, and Photoshop just crashes and ruins my day. So another great thing about designing in browser is every time you hit save to reload your changes, it turns out it saves your changes, so you don't have to worry about your software crashing. And if the browser crashes, it doesn't really affect your code or your work environment. One thing I feel really, really passionate about is giving designers commit access. I know it's a risk sometimes, but I think it's really, 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 really important, both for designers to want to be able to contribute to the developer workflow and also for developers to trust their designers a little more. So building this trust between your teams can actually be really beneficial. It allows the developers not to have to do kind of bullshit like work and like just transferring assets. It allows them to work on what they want to be focused on, and allows your designers to update assets when they have new ones ready. I also really believe in investing in your employees. Teaching your designers to code, or at least giving the tools giving them the tools they need to code is incredibly important if you want to push your entire team forward. And they might surprise you. The only reason that I've learned to be as good as a developer as I am a designer is because I've been given the opportunity to. And if they might fuck up, and you might regret giving them commit access, but I guarantee you they probably won't make that mistake again. Okay, so I kind of already talked about the whole saving changes and preventing Photoshop crashes from ruining your day. So I'm kind of gonna skip through that part. So I'm gonna talk about some more tools that you could use to build websites. And so this is less of the philosophy and more of the actual things you can touch and feel and use to build the things you want to build. So you want to build real apps, and you want to build things that live in the environment, or that are built in the environment they're going to live in. So I'm going to give you some tools for that. So version control is actually a really awesome design tool. And a lot of people kind of laugh when I initially say that, but I'm going to give you a few examples that will kind of, I think, help my case. One thing is it helps you manage those assets that you have. So, as much as I would like everything to be built in browser, whether or not it's an illustration or whatever, you're going to have assets, certain images that you're going to need to update fairly regularly. There are a lot of companies now that are actually bringing their designers into the fold and having them update assets on their own. One of those is Square. Obviously, GitHub does it. It's a pretty trendy thing, I guess, that's happening. Another thing is obviously version control helps you track your changes. It also helps you track changes to design. So we use this at GitHub. We use pull requests to do a lot of our design work and iteration. So we can actually post screenshots in those pull requests and say, okay, I'm going to make this change. What do you guys think about this? And not only does it enable you to start a discussion with your coworkers, but it helps you go back and see how things used to be. Like, how was this page originally implemented? What was this other designer thinking when they did it? What were the decisions behind making it? You don't have to repeat yourself as often. So GitHub is obviously another really great tool for this. And one specific GitHub thing that is really great for designers is image diffing. And how many of you have heard of image diffing? Fewer? Okay, this is cool. I can actually teach you guys something. So image diffing is awesome. So you can actually see this in a commit message. So you just click through to a commit, and you can actually, there's a couple different modes for image diffing that allows you to see the difference in the images you just pushed to GitHub, basically. So this is one of the first views. You can see them side by side. Another one is kind of overlapping them, so you can see more granular changes. You also have them overlaid, and then also kind of hidden beneath it. It becomes fairly useful when you're doing something like icon changes, and you want to see the difference pixel by pixel. So prototyping is really, really awesome. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this and how it's a part of my process and how it might help your designers or you, concept ideas a little better. So it turns out it's really easy if you write code. And one tool I use to prototype is Github Gist. So gist.github.com if you've never used Gist, but I'm going to show you guys a little bit about these. So I use them way too often. And what's in a gist is I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about it. So you can do a lot more than you would expect with gists. And a lot of it is just encouraging a conversation around your code. So the first piece is code. So I like to open source, CSS snippets because I like to document them somewhere and keep them somewhere if I think they're going to be reusable. And I also like to see what other people have to say about them and see if they can make them better. So in the comment section, you can actually post images. You can link to a live demo so people can play with your code. And then you can also encourage feedback, which is kind of awesome. So this specific gist that I created, someone took it and they made a compass. And do people know what compass is? Kind of. Okay. So compass is, I'm breathing really heavily on this microphone. I apologize. So compass is actually just it's basically like a Sass reusable library thing. Someone basically took this and made it into a compass mix-in, which was really awesome. So if you don't want to use gist necessarily, what you can use is something called Dablet. It's an open source project by Lear Veru, who's a really well-known JavaScript developer and also designer. And you can essentially visualize those CSS snippets. So if I want to show somebody a really quick mock-up, what I'll do is I'll just drop in my CSS to tablet. It'll show me a visualization. Right here, what you're seeing is that gradient, in case you're wondering. It's not tie-dyed. So you don't have to start from scratch. There are a lot of tools out there that will give you kind of a base foundation of the CSS, like specific styles you need. If you're not planning on using the code in production, then it's perfectly okay to use some of these tools. One of them is the very well-known Bootstrap. And it's again, really great. More great, I think, for developers who don't want to spend a lot of time implementing a visual change, and great for designers who don't want to start from scratch when they're building something in CSS. Or JavaScript when you do more interactive stuff. So CSS is reusable. Don't write the same code twice. So it actually, the whole dry thing kind of drives me a little fucking nuts because it shouldn't be the thing that drives your code. But it is smart to kind of document changes that you've made. And this is a lot easier for developers, right? You can look at an older commit message, but like, how do you do it for designers? There are some things. So one thing is you can always make your code better. It's a little motivation for you. But putting it out there and getting more eyes on it is the best way to improve it. I recently gave a similar talk at JS EU, and someone else gave a talk and described what he called the Github Third Law. And it's essentially that you post something to GitHub, you open source a repo, someone takes that repo and then works on it, and you're like, fuck, they did that better than I did. So then you immediately want to take that and improve upon that. And so that's the third law of GitHub. And I just think that's a really interesting concept. It's kind of all of us pushing each other forward a little more and a little more every day. So the chances are, if you can't make your code better, someone else can. And maybe you don't agree. Maybe you don't think that a change someone makes when they fork your repo or they fork your gist is better. You don't have to, you don't have to accept that pull request if they end up sending you a pull request. You don't have to deal with it. It's just a really great way to give you a different perspective on the problem you're trying to solve. So if it's not reusable, set it all on fire. There is no better feeling than ripping out code. And even for designers, this goes without saying. It's not just a developer-specific thing. Starting from scratch is kind of the easiest way to clear your head. So pattern libraries. These are definitely a really great open source kind of tool to use to be able to build on what you've already done. So they're really awesome. So it's also a way to constantly improve your code. And I started thinking about pattern libraries on Dribbble because they have this feature called buckets. And you can actually bucket together, let's say I want to look for a specific UI piece. I want to say I want to collect a visual pattern library of what different people do for search. Really basic, right? So I can basically bucket all of these different visual, basically visual snippets of search, UIs, and then I can look at those for not only inspiration, but it's a way to approach a problem, right? I mean, you're not always going to have, the most unique and the most brilliant idea right off the bat, but it gets your mind thinking. So I started thinking about them from that perspective, but then Dan Cederholm came around and built something really interesting so far. So pattern, and I'll get to that in a second, but pattern libraries are a great way to learn from the past you, a great way to learn about, kind of how you've approached problems differently. And it's a great way to learn from each other. So the tool that I was speaking of is called Pairs. I don't know if you can see the URL up there, but it's pea.rs. So this is a tool that Dan Cederholm recently open sourced. It's on GitHub. It's actually right now, I think, only written in PHP, so I'm kind of dying for someone to take it down and write it in something else. So it's basically a way to store markup and CSS patterns instead of visually. So the way that I thought about Dribbble buckets were, this is a way for me to visually kind of experience how people are doing things, but this is a way how they're actually, to experience kind of how they're building them. And not only for other people, but for yourself. And it's a great way to go back and look at these and say, I was doing this wrong, maybe I should, and not necessarily from anybody else, but from your own, from your past self. And say, I was doing this wrong. Let me update this. And then when I need to implement something like this on the front end, I can just refer to my own pattern library. And it doesn't have to be public. You don't need to open source it. I know a lot of people kind of, especially designers, this is an interesting thing that's kind of happening is the special sauce, right? Like the magic. It's like you kind of want to hold on to the things that you do really well because you think that they're going to give you the competitive edge. I'm more of a believer that if you put your code out there, which actually most front-end code is open source, whether or not you like it to be, I'm a really big believer, and obviously GitHub is as well, is putting your code out there because it allows us kind of all to move forward. And for me, if I can save somebody 5 minutes of banging their head on their computer or on their keyboard, I will gladly do it. So style guides. This is becoming more and more popular among bigger companies, and I think this is just in order to make sure that you're communicating like the same visual language across your website, your app, whatever it is that you're building. So they kind of suck, though. You obviously don't sign up to be a designer because you want to copy and paste CSS all over the place. That's really not something that motivates you. You kind of want to be able to, I don't know, execute your own vision, what you're passionate about. So I like to think of them as considerations. So something to think about. And these are really basic things. For like a front ender, it may be, okay, like the line height on something is supposed to be even on the top and on the bottom. It might not be something that everyone necessarily knows, like especially front-end developers. It may not be something, especially if it's not something the browser does for you. So our style guide is actually open source. And I encourage you all to check it out to see how we write our code, and how we use things like our icon fonts, how we write JavaScript, how we write Ruby, because our designers actually write all of these things. So it's really cool. I encourage you guys all to check it out. It also includes all of our button styles, all these basic kind of visual language things that we'd like to not necessarily instill in our designers, but they're considerations when you're building a new UI. So the way that I learned to build websites is I consumed other websites. And I think that a really great way to build the web is use the web to do that. And that doesn't mean going to so-and-so's website and copy and pasting their CSS into your site, because I would highly advise not doing that. But there's a great way to use the web to make the web. So one thing I do is I kind of categorize things, and you're like, yeah, bookmarks, duh, Julie, we're not idiots. But one thing I do is I categorize specific resources so that I know when to get to them when I need them. And if you don't already do this, it's kind of a great way. Start sending your designers resources, whether it's just learning really trivial, Git commands, like a Git cheat sheet, whether it's learning emojis so they can autocomplete and pull requests, like just start sending them resources so they can start collecting them and categorizing them and knowing when to reach towards them when they want to learn a little more. And that just goes back to investing in your designers. So I think that's a pretty big deal. So a lot of designers look at the command line and they're like, what the fuck? This isn't hackers. I don't know what to do. So yeah, command line tools, they're not easy. They're really not. Yeah, and Git, it can be really confusing. Nothing, certain commands aren't necessarily intuitive or logical, and neither is the GUI of the command line to begin with. So GitHub has actually found a really great way to help designers. And one of those ways is GitHub for Mac. Does anyone use GitHub for Mac? Oh, that's awesome. How cool. So GitHub for Mac is basically a GUI interface on top of the command line, and it's really easy to update branches. You literally hit a sync button, and it syncs for you, so you don't really have to worry, unless you're in merge conflict hell, you don't really have to worry about, stashing things and, I don't know, more complicated things than designers necessarily think to worry about. So the reason I give this talk is because I kind of want to encourage everybody to learn a little more. I want to encourage developers to learn a little bit more about the design process, but also designers to take a few pieces of what developers are doing into their own environment and their own process. And I would love to encourage you all to give me feedback and let me know if there's anything you're doing specifically that you think could contribute to pushing us all forward. And thank you, guys. It's been great.